And a woman spoke, saying, "Tell us of pain." And he said, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding." Kahlil Jibran, the Prophet. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. The Prophet is a short book of poetry that was published all the way back in 1923 by Lebanese-American author Kahlil Jibran. It's had an enduring appeal during its entire 100-year existence, and even to this day, it's very popular as a gift for newlyweds. It sold over 100 million copies worldwide, translated into 100 different languages. Despite it being quite short, the audiobook is less than 2 hours long. The paperback is about 120 pages long, depending on the copy that you have. Today, we're going to be reviewing it with regular contributor Aamer Khan. Aamer, how's it going?
It's going well. Hello, everyone.
Can you contextualize this book? Tell us a little bit about why Gibran is still so venerated around the world, and tell us about what this book really is at its heart and why it's so popular.
So the easiest way to put it is this book is quite dense for its size. I mean, you mentioned it's only about 120 something pages long, but the way it's written really makes you think about almost every sentence that's in the book. It's not complex to understand in terms of reading it, but each sentence says a lot more than what the initial sort of impact is when you read it.
Yeah.
So it's described as a work of prose and poetry, both. And when you start to read it, you start to wonder about the author because it's written particularly well and particularly impactful in terms of appealing to both your mind in terms of your brain as well as your heart in terms of your emotions. So it's hitting both those places as you read, and you really start to wonder about Kahlil Gibran himself.
It has a format to it as well. It's a book of prose / poetry, but it has a fictional plot to it, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, the plot is basically of an older man who has been waiting his entire life for a ship to come in, and that ship has arrived, and the village people are basically saying goodbye to him, but want to ask him some questions and impart his last words of wisdom to them before he gets onto this ship. And even that's a metaphor, I'm sure, in a lot of ways in terms of end of life and some other pieces. But there is an actual fictional storyline to this, and the townspeople basically ask him various questions about many philosophical and emotional pieces that a lot of us have questions about.
Yeah, and I think there's 26 different chapters where each chapter is essentially somebody in the crowd asking the prophet, this guy, Al Mustafa, about his thoughts, um, his wisdom on a certain topic. So a mason is going to ask about houses. A scholar is going to ask about talking, that type of thing. But there's chapters about all sorts of things. Like there are chapters about love, marriage and children, clothing, buying and selling, laws, crime and punishment, freedom, food and drink, death, friendship, reason and passion. It's lots of themes that are universal, and something that you'll hear a lot if you go online and look at what people say about this book is that it's aggressively non-sectarian. It doesn't come from a specific culture. All of the wisdom that comes out of this book is very universal, which I would argue is part of what makes it so beautiful.
I would totally agree. I mean, I
Mm.
think the thing that people have in terms of feedback the most about this book is that it is all encompassing of the human condition and humanity in general.
Exactly.
And like you said, it's very sort of non-denominational in terms of it pulls from many different cultures and many different religions. The other sort of praise for this book is really around the idea of the encompassing part, where the author doesn't shy away from difficult subjects, right? So
Hmm.
we see poems about death and destruction, and we see poems about life and happiness, but typically not together. And this book does all of it in a very sort of light-handed and masterful way, where it doesn't drive you into the depths of despair, and doesn't sort of elevate you, but it's really makes you think about different things. I mean, even the topics on death in terms of how it's put, or wedding or joy, is very well explained and sort of poetrized, if I can use that word.
It uses a lot of analogies and metaphors to very elegantly lay out simple ideas that are very digestible and in ways that feel practical. And there are 8 chapters that I want to highlight here that have specific ideas that I'm going to share, just so that for the people who haven't read it, or the people who have read it in the past but just kind of want to like a bit of a recap, jolt your memory a little bit, just to give you the sort of ideas that come out of this book. So very early on, there's a chapter on marriage, and he describes how, and by he, I mean Al Mustafa, but Al Mustafa is somewhat of um, like a placeholder for Kahlil Jibran himself. I kind of saw it that way.
Yeah, and I think in the because there's 2 books with regards to the Prophet, and the Garden of the Prophet. I believe in the first book he's not actually named, so he's just known as a man or a prophet. I think
You're
he's supposed
right,
to be,
eh?
yeah, he's
Yeah, that's
supposed to be,
true.
I think, somewhat non-specific, and sort of generic in terms of, just a man with a wisdom. Because a lot of the book, he talks about him just being sort of a normal guy and not being full of pride. And there's other passages in the book where he talks about just not interacting with people because he wants to watch and observe people from afar and things like that.
So this chapter on marriage, one of the things he says is that there needs to be space between the two in a couple. Quote, even
I
as
love
the
that.
strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music. That's a beautiful way to say that you have 2 individuals in a relationship, in a couple, in a married couple, but they're still individuals, and that if they're not alone, they lose their individuality. And I I think this is a message that people kind of forget, and it kind of applies to parenting as well. That when you have a kid, a lot of people describe they kind of lose their individuality because they just sort of like exist as an extension of their child, or
Child.
their child is an extension of themselves, and neither has that individuality.
Yep. And I think with the marriage, when it goes on to say that you can't have one heart, there's always 2 hearts with 2 people.
Yes, yeah,
So some great
exactly.
analogies and metaphors that he talks about. And as I was saying before we got started, I mean, there's a lot of chapters and pieces which I actually rewinded. I typically don't go back and listen to something again with any audiobook, but for this one, I really enjoyed going back and re-listening to some of the content, because it is quite uh, beautiful and dense. But you do get a lot more out of it the second time you read it in a lot of cases.
Do not speed up the narration of this book. I beg you. You're not doing yourself any favors. You need time to digest what is being said here. And he'll have one
Yeah,
brilliant idea and just move on to the next one. And sometimes things are a little bit ambiguous, and they're left up to interpretation. And again, I'd argue that's part of the beauty. In that chapter about marriage, he goes on to paint this other metaphor, this analogy, and say that in a relationship, in a married couple, you need to both be pillars, but to stand apart to hold up the temple. You will never build a temple and have 2 pillars standing right next to each other, because what's the point? And the temple would crumble. You need to spread them out, right?
yeah.
And I know, okay, the next one we want to highlight was the second chapter that we thought was very impactful. And you had thoughts on this one. It was about children.
It was, yeah, and similar to the one with marriage, it talks about, and you alluded to this earlier, Jacob, that children are your children, but you can't live for them and you can't live through them. They have to be individual people, and you can guide them, but that children are a more of a reflection of life itself rather than life from you. So again, some really great prose and poetry from Gibran in terms of how to approach raising children.
And the line in one of the first lines in this chapter is one of the most quoted lines of the entire book. And it's pretty simple. It's just, your children are not your children. Essentially, it just means that they belong with you, but not to you. They are not yours. It's not a possession. They are their own individual. Again, continuing this theme of individuality.
Yeah, and I think he's really good at sort of evoking some minor outrage too, because the first time you read that line, your children are not your children. You're like, what? What are you talking?
Yeah, it's quite provoking, right?
Yeah, and then he goes to explain, and you're like, oh yeah, that does make sense.
And I like to take the lessons that he presents in this book here and put it in like a modern context.
Hmm.
But that just speaks to the universality, because this was written in 1923, and so many of these things, there's nothing here that doesn't apply anymore. Basically, it all
Exactly.
still applies. It's really quite impressive. There's a chapter on houses where a mason asks the prophet to talk to us about homes, and I love this quote here: "Your house is your larger body." And I think that nobody disagrees that somebody's home says so much about them. But this quote is such an elegant way of expressing that idea, right? When you have a home and it's dirty, you feel dirty. When you're in your home and things are broken, you feel it. It's really is an extension of you.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned the elegance of it, and that's a great word to describe this book. It is very elegant. It's not the type of book like you were saying to speed up, and it's also not a book you want to sort of do while you're doing other things. You really want to pay attention when you're reading this book.
There was a pretty funny chapter. Probably the weirdest chapter to me was the one on clothing, because it was funny to me because it was painting clothing as being a sort of harness and chain that we have to wear to keep our modesty, and that clothing only exists because of the unclean eye. And he goes on to say that our bare feet beg to touch the sand and the soil, which, like, is he advocating for nudity? I'm confused. This is this is the weirdest chapter for me by far.
I think the way I understood it was that the opposite, actually, that you should stay covered up, but that walking around barefoot is pleasurable, and having the wind play at your hair is, I think, the other side of that quote.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, that's right.
so for me, it evoked an image of wearing something like a long robe or something like that, because the first part of what he's talking about is basically that, yeah, you need clothes to cover up, and then the second part is sort of saying that it's nice to not have clothes. So like a lot of the things in in this book, there's a duality to it. Um, but the picture I got was being covered up in terms of except your bare feet on the ground and the wind in your hair.
Okay, this is what I mean. Yes, a lot of these things are still up to interpretation. But I would also want to mention that there are 26 chapters in an hour and a half long audiobook. And so these chapters go by very fast. And this is where that
Very quickly.
density comes in, right? Some of these chapters I listened to again like 3 times to, and I'm still not sure what to make of them in some cases. Another chapter I want to highlight is the one on buying and selling. This was after a merchant asked the prophet about this. Here's a quote: "To you, the earth yields her fruit, and you shall not want but if you know how to fill your hands. It is in exchanging the gifts of the earth that you shall find abundance and be satisfied. Yet, unless the exchange be in love and kindly justice, it will lead some others to hunger and others to greed." This is wild to me because it's essentially the same that I read in Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Walt Kimmer. It's the gift economy that he's describing here. This indigenous idea of the gift economy. When you understand that the fruits of Mother Nature are a gift, then you can't ever in good faith exchange greedily. It's like if somebody gave you a gift, you would not sell it for profit. If everything you acquire is a gift of Mother Nature, then you would never sell it at a ridiculous price. You exchange for other gifts of the earth, and things just have more intrinsic value that way. Interesting to see that an indigenous teaching and a Lebanese American essentially came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of this book, he basically describes the underlying importance of intention. I think that that chapter goes on to basically say that essentially, I'm boiling it down, of course, but that, buying and selling things is okay, but when you're doing it just for the profit, it basically corrupts your soul. And he has a lot of that sort of theme in other chapters as well, in terms of, this and this is okay, but if you do it to an extreme here or there, then you're going down the wrong path.
And as I understand it, Kahlil Jibran was a Christian Lebanese American. But this idea of intentionality, especially from this chapter, like you mentioned, Amr, is very much a Muslim value in Islam.
Indeed.
Intentionality is extremely important.
Yep. Yep.
Hmm.
Definitely.
I love how he describes dancers and singers as offerers of their own fruit. That what artists sell is food for our souls, and that just because they're not literally plucking from Mother Nature, they're creating their own fruit. Kind of an advocacy of art and artists. Love that bit.
Indeed. And he himself was actually an artist too. It's important to note.
Of
He
course,
did. He
he's a
did.
poet.
No, not only that, he painted as well.
Was he a
So this,
painter? Huh.
yes, there's actually illustrations that go with this book too. I haven't had
Oh.
them audio described, but
Mhm.
he was also a painter, and classically educated that way.
Okay, one another chapter that got a lot of attention out of this one over the years was the one on freedom because it points out the paradox of freedom. He suggests that if you are the only way that you know you really have freedom is when you stop seeking it. And if you don't seek freedom, that means you have freedom essentially. Do you not see the paradox in that?
Yeah, I mean, that chapter, as well as the one with crime and punishment, is probably the most complex. Um, because again, he goes backwards and forwards on some points in terms of, well, you
Mhm.
have to punish people, but there's a reason why they're acting the way they are. But and it sort of goes on from those types of chains, and the same is true for freedom, as you mentioned, in terms of, well, if you don't seek it, then again, going back to intentionality about without living while thinking, rather than just living and just going along with the flow.
Yeah, I think to clarify, he also suggests that longing for freedom can in itself be a shackle. If it's something that you're always seeking,
Yep.
then you can have that lack of freedom, right?
Yep.
Another chapter I really appreciated was one on talking. A scholar shouts out to the prophet. It's kind of funny. He says, "Tell us about talking." Here's the quote. And then a scholar said, "Speak of talking." And then he answered, saying, "You talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts." You talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. Man, dude, this had me debating with myself for like half an hour whether this is true or not because it kind of annoyed me to think of how much we all talk and that kind of implies that we are all not at peace. It implies that I'm not at peace right now because I'm talking. But being at peace with our thoughts is not the same with being at peace with ourselves. Our thoughts are only a part of us, like our conscious internal dialogue, I would argue. um i don't think I don't think our thoughts include our subconscious minds, and our subconscious informs so much more about who we are than our conscious, I would argue. So every time you say something, it's because you just have to get it out there. You're not at peace. You need to get it out there, and you'll only be at peace until you let it out there. And I think we all get that feeling of like, I just need to say this. I just need to say this and get it out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's this concept of being heard as well, right?
Yes. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's part of it. I mean, I think this is the whole point of the book, right? To start thinking about things in different ways, and debating yourselves. And he's very careful not to go into absolutes, and sort of, like I said, back and forth in terms of extremes, and underlying and underscoring the need for balance, with good intentions. And this is a good example of it. I mean, like, of course, he's not telling us not to talk and that everybody's at peace when they're not talking. I mean, there's definitely people out there who are not at peace when they're silent. But it evokes thinking, memory, discussion, all those sorts of things.
To me, it evokes thinking before talking. And that if you're, because he continues on in this chapter to say that talking ends up being a placeholder, a pastime, if you will. And I think
Yeah.
about this, like when you're in a love, like when you're with a loved one and you're both comfortable in that silence, you're
Hmm.
both at peace in that moment. Nothing needs to be said unless you
Hmm.
just had a huge fight, in which case you're just delaying it.
Indeed. Yeah.
One more chapter I want to highlight. This is the eighth one I want to highlight. They have the chapter on, he has a chapter on beauty. And he goes on to say that beauty is not a need, it's not a requirement, it's an ecstasy. You never need it, but when you find it, you don't just appreciate it, you experience it. And I thought that was beautifully put. And then that experience of beauty is one of the most human feelings you can possibly imagine.
Yeah. It's particularly powerful. I mean, you can boil it down to beauty is only skin deep, but Gibran puts it in such a more beautiful way, in terms of what you just said.
This book uses a lot of analogies, like a lot.
It's
X
mostly analogies,
X is
but
Y. It's almost all analogies. And a common criticism that I've seen online for this book is that it's actually quite basic. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it doesn't pretend to be what it is. I mean, I mentioned Gibran's sort of classic education, and we have to remember again, 1923. He was born in Lebanon and then moved to the States when he was 12, and then moved back to Lebanon for education when he was 15. And didn't go through sort of a traditional school system. He went through a lot of mentoring with lots of people of that time. He lived only
Mm,
48 years,
wow.
but
Mm.
he spanned from the late 1800s to 1931, I believe. So a lot happened worldwide, not just in terms of philosophy and thinking, but in terms of technology and those pieces too. So he was very well traveled and well educated in that sense. And this book, I think, is a reflection of all this sort of the things that he picked up along the way, as his education, and as he made his way as an artist and author and painter.
100 million copies sold worldwide, translated into 100 different languages. Part of that to me has to be because of the format, the context around it, in that uh, it's kind of packaged in like this list of 26 little chunks of wisdom on different topics. And it reminds me of list videos on YouTube, right? Like nowadays, everybody makes lists, and like this was just way ahead of the time, wasn't it?
Indeed, indeed, it's indexed, right? And I think that's what uh,
Index. Ah, yes,
is.
that's the scholarly way of saying it.
Yeah, I'll just use the non-YouTube way of saying it.
Yes.
But it's indexed, and I was sort of surprised and not surprised at the same time to learn that a lot of people use quotes from this book for wedding speeches.
Yeah,
Um,
super popular.
so that was a little bit of nugget that came my way. I'm like, oh, it's interesting.
He published another book in the 1930s called The Garden of the Prophet, which essentially closes the loop of the plot. What's the context around that one?
So I think it was sort of a swan song for him, if I had to guess. But basically, the prophet, the first book is, as we said, the plot is a man waiting for his ship. He gets on his ship and he sort of goes away. Um, the Prophet of the Garden, which is the second book, is also a short book, less than 120 pages, I believe, about the same length. And it's about him going back to his hometown. So it's not clear if it's the same town or not, but basically his ship comes in and he's back to the place of his birth. And we see a lot of the same style and prose and poetry from the prophet. Um, I think it's undisputed that the prophet is his work of mastery, in terms of being the most popular and the best written and all that. I found the prophet of the garden quite good as well. Again, same sort of theme, same sort of writing style. I think it's a different book in terms of that whole concept of coming back to your hometown
Hmm.
and going through that. Um, Whereas the prophet is much more general.
I thought The Garden of the Prophet was somewhat forgettable compared to the Prophet, the original. Uh, And I think part of me is my 21st century lizard brain that just liked that it was separated into 26 different
Six
little
chapters.
chapters.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
something about that that makes it so much more digestible, and I totally fell into it. Poetry is not something that comes naturally to me. Even especially flowery prose do not come naturally to me. But this is
Eh,
very digestible. This book is a paradox because it is so dense, like you described, but incredibly digestible.
Yeah, it's simplistic in its sort of organization, structure, style, and even word choices. But in
Yes.
terms of its in terms of what he's trying to say, in terms of the themes and the philosophy behind it, it's quite dense. So, and I think that goes to its popularity. I mean, it basically it's easy to read, and then you start thinking about it, which is a lot more in terms of not easy to think about these things, but I mean, like I said, this is a great book that you really want to pay attention to and not do other things when you're doing it. One of my favorite quotes from this book is basically that joy is sorrow unmasked.
Hmm.
So you start to think about that, and one of the questions from the crowd is basically, "Tell us about joy," and he's like, "Well, joy is sorrow unmasked." And you're like, "What? What does that mean?" And he goes on to explain, and again in his analogy formats, but that particularly stuck out to me in terms of a great quote from the book.
Yeah, I think in that chapter he uses the analogy of a balance where joy is on one side and sorrow is on the
Hmm.
other, and that you have to keep a balance because the joy can't move without there being sorrow on the other end. They go together. They're just two different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, and he goes through duality too. In I don't know if in this chapter, but definitely in other chapters, where he talks about one thing is the same as the other, but unmasked or underneath, or the opposite, and how one can
Mm.
turn into the other. I think that was on happiness as well. So yeah.
Kahlil was Lebanese American, but it would be important for people to know that this book was originally written in English. And so, if you were wondering if this is a translation, if that might push you away from it, it is written in English originally. Amr, before we wrap up, any final thoughts on this book?
Just that it was a pleasure to read. It's not a long book. Don't try to read it all in one go. That would be my advice. Take it,
Savor
those
it.
26, savor it, think about it, and it's a lot of fun to read with somebody else too, in terms of talking about these things, just as we've been talking.
Awesome. Amr, thank you so much for recommending this one.
No problem. My pleasure.
That was regular contributor Aamer Khan. We were reviewing The Prophet by Kahlil Jibran. That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. We're also on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can email us feedback at audiobookraview@ami.ca. That's audiobookraview@ami.ca. We love to hear your feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram at AMI Audio Book Review. That's at AMI Audio Book Review. I'm Jacob Shymanski. Happy listening.